The room was heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional sniffle or muffled sob. Daisy stood at the edge of the crowd, clutching her mother's favorite stuffed rabbit tightly to her chest, and everyone looked at her with sad eyes that made her stomach twist. Her father's hand rested on her shoulder, but it felt distant, like he wasn't really there. Daisy didn't understand why everyone was crying. They kept saying her mother was gone, but she didn't know what that meant. Gone where? Why couldn't she come back? The coffin sat at the front of the room, its lid open. Daisy had seen it earlier, but she hadn't looked inside. Not yet. She didn't want to. But now, as the line of people moved forward to say their goodbyes, her father gently nudged her forward. "It's time, Daisy," he whispered, his voice cracking. Her small feet shuffled across the carpet, her heart pounding in her ears. The rabbit's fur was damp from her sweaty palms, but she held it tighter, as if it could protect her from whatever was inside that box. When she reached the coffin, she hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't want to look, but something pulled her forward, forcing her to peer over the edge. And then she saw her. Her mother lay there, so still, so pale, her hands folded neatly over her chest. Daisy's eyes darted to her face, searching for something familiar, something warm. But her mother's face was wrong, too still, too empty. Daisy's gaze dropped to her hands, and that's when she noticed it. The birthmark. It was gone. Her mother's right wrist had always had a small, dark mark, shaped like a tiny star. Daisy had traced it with her fingers countless times, asking her mother how it got there. "It's my special mark," her mother would say, smiling. "Just for you." But now the wrist was smooth, unmarked. Daisy's chest tightened, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She leaned closer, her small hands gripping the edge of the coffin. "That's not my mama," she screamed, her voice piercing the silence. "She had a birthmark. Where's her birthmark?" The room froze. All eyes turned to her, wide and startled. Her father rushed to her side, pulling her back gently. "Daisy, sweetheart, it's okay. You're just upset." "No!" she shouted, tears streaming down her face. "That's not her! That's not my mama!" The whispers started then, soft and uncertain, rippling through the crowd. Her uncle stepped forward, his face pale as he glanced into the coffin. "What's she talking about?" he asked, his voice low. Daisy's father hesitated, his eyes darting to the body. He leaned closer, his brow furrowing. I don't know," he murmured. "But she's right. Her mother had a birthmark. This isn't her." The room erupted into chaos. The funeral director, a tall man with a somber expression, hurried over, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with concern. Daisy's father straightened, his face a mix of confusion and anger. "Yes, there's a problem. This isn't my wife. My daughter is right. Her mother had a birthmark on her wrist. This woman doesn't." The director's eyes widened, and he quickly glanced at the coffin. "I assure you, sir, there must be some mistake. This is the body that was brought to us. We followed all the proper procedures." "Then someone made a mistake," Daisy's uncle interrupted, his voice rising. "This isn't her. Look at her. Does she even look like my sister to you?" The room buzzed with murmurs as the mourners exchanged uneasy glances. Daisy clung to her father's leg, her small body trembling. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew one thing for sure. The woman in the coffin wasn't her mother. Her father knelt down, his hands gripping her shoulders. "Daisy, are you absolutely sure? You're not just imagining things?" She shook her head fiercely, her tears still flowing. "I'm sure, Daddy. Mama had a star on her wrist. This lady doesn't. She's not Mama." Her father's face hardened, and he stood up, turning to the funeral director. "We need answers, now." The director nodded, his professional demeanor slipping slightly. "Of course. Let me make some calls. We'll get to the bottom of this." As the director hurried away, Daisy's uncle pulled her father aside. "This doesn't make sense. How could this happen? Who is that woman?" "I don't know," her father replied, his voice tight with frustration. "But I'm going to find out." Daisy watched as the adults huddled together, their voices low and urgent. She felt small and scared, but also a strange sense of determination. She had been the one to notice the missing birthmark. She had been the one to speak up, and now she wanted to help find her mother. Her father turned back to her, his expression softening. Daisy, I need you to be brave, okay? We're going to figure this out, but I need you to stay close to me. She nodded, clutching the stuffed rabbit even tighter. I'll be brave, Daddy. I want to find Mama. He gave her a small, strained smile and took her hand. Good girl, let's go. The funeral home became a whirlwind of activity. Police were called, and the room that had been filled with mourners was now crowded with officers, detectives, and forensic experts. The coffin was cordoned off, and the imposter's body was carefully examined. Daisy sat in a corner, her legs tucked under her, watching everything with wide eyes. Her father stayed close, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. A detective, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, approached them. Mr. Thompson, I'm Detective Harris. I need to ask you and your daughter a few questions. Daisy's father nodded. Of course, whatever you need. Detective Harris knelt down to Daisy's level, her voice gentle but firm. Hi, Daisy. I know this is really scary, but you've been very brave. Can you tell me what you saw? Daisy hesitated, then nodded. The lady in the box, she's not my mama. My mama has a star on her wrist. This lady doesn't. Detective Harris glanced at Daisy's father, who confirmed. My wife has a small birthmark on her right wrist. Daisy's right. It's not there. The detective made a note in her pad. Thank you, Daisy. You've been very helpful. She stood up and turned to Daisy's father. We're going to need to review the medical records and the chain of custody for the body. This could be a case of mistaken identity or something more serious. Daisy's father's jaw tightened. You think someone did this on purpose? It's too early to say, Detective Harris replied, but we're going to investigate every possibility. As the detective walked away, Daisy tugged on her father's sleeve. Daddy, where's Mama? If that's not her, where is she? He knelt down, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. I don't know, sweetheart, but we're going to find her. I promise. Hours passed, and the investigation continued. Daisy's father was pulled into conversations with the police, leaving her with a family friend who tried to distract her with coloring books and snacks. But Daisy couldn't focus. Her mind kept drifting back to her mother. She remembered the last time she saw her, just a few days ago. Her mother had been acting strange, whispering on the phone and looking over her shoulder. Daisy had asked her what was wrong, but her mother had just smiled and said, Nothing, sweetheart. Everything's fine. But it wasn't fine, and now her mother was gone. Daisy slipped away from the family friend and wandered back to the room where the coffin had been. It was empty now, the imposter's body taken away for further examination. She stood in the doorway, her heart pounding. Something felt off. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room, and then she saw it, a small piece of paper, crumpled and half hidden under a chair. She picked it up and unfolded it, her small fingers trembling. It was a note written in her mother's handwriting. Daisy's breath caught as she read the words. If you're reading this, something has happened to me. Trust no one. Find the key. It's in the rabbit. Daisy's eyes widened. The rabbit. Her mother's favorite stuffed rabbit, the one she was holding right now. She clutched the note tightly and ran back to her father, her heart racing. Daddy, look! He took the note, his face pale as he read it. Where did you find this? In the room, Daisy said, pointing. And Mama said to find the key. It's in the rabbit. Her father's hand shook as he examined the stuffed animal. He turned it over, feeling along the seams. And then he found it. A small, hidden pocket stitched into the fabric. Inside was a tiny key. What does it open? Daisy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her father's eyes met hers, filled with a mixture of fear and determination. I don't know, but we're going to find out. The key was small and silver, its edges worn smooth. Daisy's father held it in his palm, staring at it as if it held the answers to all their questions. Around them, the police were still busy, but Daisy and her father were focused on the note and the key. We need to figure out what this key opens, her father said, his voice low. Your mother left this for a reason. She knew something was wrong. Daisy nodded, her heart pounding. Where do we start, Daddy? He thought for a moment, then pulled out his phone. First, we need to check our house. If your mother hid this key, there might be something there she wanted us to find. They left the funeral home quietly, slipping past the chaos. The drive home was tense, the silence heavy with unspoken fears. Daisy clutched the stuffed rabbit, her mind racing. What could the key open? And why did her mother say to trust no one? When they arrived home, the house felt different, empty and cold, as if it knew her mother was missing. Daisy's father went straight to her mother's study, a small room filled with books and papers. He began searching through drawers and cabinets, looking for anything that might match the key. Daisy stood in the doorway, watching. Daddy, what are we looking for? I'm not sure, he admitted. A lockbox, a safe, maybe a diary. Something your mother wanted us to find. Daisy's eyes wandered around the room, and then she noticed something. A small, decorative box on the top shelf of the bookcase. It was painted with flowers, just like the ones her mother loved. Daddy, what about that? She asked, pointing. He followed her gaze and quickly grabbed the box. It was light, but when he shook it gently, something rattled inside. He examined the lock, a small, silver keyhole. It matched the key. His hands trembled as he inserted the key and turned it. The lock clicked, and the lid popped open. Inside was a stack of papers, a USB drive, and a handwritten letter addressed to him. Daisy's father picked up the letter, his face pale. It's from your mother, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He unfolded the letter and began to read aloud. My love, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. I've discovered something terrible. Someone close to us has been plotting against our family. I don't know who to trust anymore, so I've hidden the evidence here. The USB drive contains everything. Please be careful. I love you both so much. Find me. Daisy's father sank into a chair, his face ashen. Oh my God, he murmured. She knew. She knew this was coming. Daisy climbed onto his lap, her small hands gripping his shirt. Daddy, what does it mean? Who's plotting against us? He hugged her tightly, his voice shaking. I don't know, sweetheart, but we're going to find out, and we're going to find your mother. Daisy's father plugged the USB drive into his laptop, his hands still trembling. The screen lit up, revealing a folder filled with documents, photos, and audio files. He opened the first file, a recorded conversation between Daisy's mother and an unknown man. The voices were hushed, tense. Daisy's mother sounded scared. I know what you're planning, she said. I won't let you get away with this. The man's voice was cold, menacing. You don't have a choice. If you try to stop me, you'll regret it. The recording ended abruptly, leaving the room in silence. Daisy's father stared at the screen, his face a mask of shock and anger. Who is that? He whispered. Who was she talking to? Daisy's eyes were wide with fear. Daddy, is that the bad person? He nodded slowly. Yes, sweetheart, and we need to find out who it is. They spent the next hour going through the files. There were financial records, emails, and photos, all pointing to a conspiracy involving someone close to the family. Daisy's mother had been investigating for weeks, gathering evidence to expose the truth. One name kept appearing in the documents. Richard, Daisy's uncle. Her father's face darkened as he read through the emails. Richard, he's been stealing from us, and he was planning to get rid of your mother. Daisy's heart sank. Uncle Richard, but he's family. I know, her father said, his voice heavy with grief. But sometimes people we trust can hurt us the most. He picked up his phone and called Detective Harris. We found something. You need to see this. Detective Harris arrived quickly, her sharp eyes scanning the documents and listening to the recordings. Her expression grew grimmer with each piece of evidence. This is serious, she said finally. We need to act fast. If your wife is still alive, we don't have much time. Daisy's father nodded, his jaw clenched. What do we do? We'll confront Richard, Detective Harris said, but we need to be careful. If he realizes we're onto him, he might panic and do something reckless. Daisy clung to her father's hand, her small face pale with fear. What about Mama? Where is she? Detective Harris knelt down to Daisy's level. We're going to find her, sweetheart, but I need you to be brave a little longer, okay? Daisy nodded, though her lower lip trembled. I'll be brave. The plan was set in motion. Detective Harris arranged for a team of officers to surround Richard's house while she and Daisy's father confronted him. Daisy stayed behind with a trusted family friend, though she begged to go with them. I want to help find Mama, she cried. Her father knelt down, his hands on her shoulders. I know you do, sweetheart, but this is too dangerous. Stay here, and we'll bring your mother back. I promise, reluctantly Daisy agreed, clutching the stuffed rabbit tightly. Bring her home, Daddy. At Richard's house, the tension was palpable. Detective Harris knocked on the door, her hand resting on her holstered weapon. Richard opened the door, his face a mask of surprise. What's going on? He asked, his voice too casual. We need to talk, Daisy's father said, his tone icy. Inside. Richard hesitated, then stepped aside. As soon as the door closed, Detective Harris pulled out the USB drive. We know everything, Richard. The theft, the plot against your sister-in-law. Where is she? Richard's face went pale, but he quickly recovered, forcing a laugh. I don't know what you're talking about. This is insane. We have evidence, Detective Harris said, her voice firm. Emails, recordings, financial records. It's over, Richard. Tell us where she is and it'll go easier for you. For a moment, Richard looked like he might deny it again, but then his shoulders slumped and he sank into a chair. It wasn't supposed to go this far, he muttered. I just wanted the money. But she found out. She was going to ruin everything. Where is she? Daisy's father demanded, his voice shaking with anger. Richard hesitated, then sighed. There's a cabin in the woods, about an hour from here. She's there. But she's not alone. I hired someone to keep her quiet. Detective Harris immediately radioed her team, giving them the location. We're moving in now, she said. You're under arrest, Richard. As the officers handcuffed Richard, Daisy's father turned to Detective Harris. I'm coming with you. She nodded. Let's go. The drive to the cabin felt like an eternity. Daisy's father sat in the passenger seat, his hands clenched into fists. When they arrived, the police moved in quickly, surrounding the cabin. Inside, they found Daisy's mother, bound and gagged but alive. Her eyes filled with tears when she saw her husband. You're safe now, he whispered, holding her tightly. We're going home. Daisy was waiting at the door when they returned. The moment she saw her mother, she ran to her, tears streaming down her face. Mama! Her mother knelt down, wrapping her arms around Daisy. I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here. The family clung to each other, their relief palpable. The nightmare was over, but the scars would take time to heal. Richard was in custody, and the investigation revealed the full extent of his crimes. Daisy's mother had been brave, gathering evidence to protect her family, even at great personal risk. As they sat together that evening, Daisy held her mother's hand, tracing the small star-shaped birthmark on her wrist. I knew it was you, she said softly. I knew it wasn't that other lady. Her mother smiled, tears in her eyes. You were so brave, Daisy. You saved me. Daisy's father hugged them both, his voice filled with emotion. We're a family, and no one will ever tear us apart again.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.